taking the wheel, first off this morning is Skott Klebe from Copyright Clearance Center. Skott has worked in copyright and licensing technology for more than 15 years, leading the development of some of the largest licensing systems in the world. Skott was the architect of RightsLink, Copyright Clearance Center's point-of-contact licensing system, and is the inventor on several patents in the fields of content and licensing. He speaks regularly at publishing industry events like this on topics including copyright technology and disruption to the people marketplace.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Tim and the team before I start for the privilege of being here to talk to you all. And I was going to talk to you about my 15 years of experience and all that, but Tim took those words out of my mouth, so I'll just go right on and start. So today I'm going to take a wandering trip through a little bit of history of open access and the CC BY license. Talk about some of the copyright implications, as well as some nuances and complications at the corners of the license and the copyright. And I'm going to close with an extended metaphor from the oldest form of open licensing and open source software. What can we learn from what's happening there? What can we take away as we look into our future? So how do we get to open access in the CC BY? I hear a lot of discussion of what license is appropriate for CC BY. There's certainly one license that is designated by government organizations and funding organizations more often than any other, and that is the CC BY. So how did we get here? Well, I'm going to spoil it for you. That's a picture of Budapest in the background. During the rapidly moving history of open access publishing, we go through a number of conferences in cities starting with B, Budapest, Berlin, Bethesda, and so on, and first defining the term open access and landing on what the conveners of those conferences intended that to mean. And rapidly thereafter, we have that definition being adopted by a number of organizations like the Wellcome Trust, RCK, most recently the Gates Foundation requiring that CC BY to be the license on all research that it funds, really in keeping with their interpretation of what they think that the definition of open access means. So what is that definition? So it's freely available. They don't keep it a secret or make you pay to read it. It's free availability on the public internet to read, download long list of permissions, use them for any other lawful purpose without financial, legal, or technical barriers. So content published under open access should be available for use for a wide variety of uses, including commercial. It limits it to constraints: control of integrity and the right to be properly acknowledged and cited. I think this is a pretty resounding sentence from the first paragraph of the definition, with a lot of meaning in it. I'm going to unpack this a couple of times through my discussion. The literature that should be freely accessible online is that which scholars give the world without expectation of payment. It reflects the unusual signature nature of scholarly publishing, in which it's not like a novelist writing a novel and seeking publication for the advance in the royalties or the band that is seeking publication for the platinum album at the end of the rainbow. You're seeking to contribute to a commons of knowledge, and you're not expecting direct compensation from the publisher for it. So, I mentioned earlier, Wellcome Trust, Gates Foundation, RCK, NIH have designated either the CC BY or a license substantially similar to it as the license for research that they fund, or for which in particular they pay publication fees. So there's been some consensus on that in part of the community. So what does CC BY mean? What does it actually convey? It describes itself as an open license. It requires that CC BY license materials must be free to share and adapt for any purpose, even commercially. The exclamation point, I believe, is right there in I may have added, actually, I may add the exclamation point, with proper attribution. And it goes on to talk about what proper attribution is. But key points are that it is irrevocable. Once you have designated a piece of work as being covered by the CC BY license or a Creative Commons license, you can't go back on that decision for that work. A user who is making use of the content under the terms of the CC BY, or trying to, but does not follow its prescriptions, loses that license, loses that permission. It describes it as automatic termination. You can remedy that automatic termination by coming back into compliance with the license, say by restoring attribution if your attribution was inadequate or incorrect in the first place. So CC BY attribution means you must display these factors listed up front, and also there's you must remove creator attribution if requested by the licensor. That's an interesting prescription as well, meaning that say, for instance, that suppose you had authored an article or you had done research and determined that a particular industrial chemical caused cancer in 60% of people who work with it, and your paper was republished in a industry-funded anthology with an introduction saying, these are papers that show that a large fraction of people using the chemical never get cancer at all. And so that, in other words, trying to use your words in a way, you put your name as endorsing a position that you didn't intend to endorse. You could request the removal of that, you intend to be able to request the removal of the attribution when appropriate. So it's important to understand that the Creative Commons, the CC BY is a license. It's not a revocation of copyright. It's not a renunciation of copyright. It uses copyright in order to ensure free access. Copyright offers initially at the point of creation a set of exclusive rights, the right to exclude other people from 5 activities: reproducing the work, deriving new works from it, distributing the work, displaying it, performing it, and so on. The CC BY license says that the creator or the licensor grants permission to do all of those with a few restrictions, and removes those permissions if those restrictions are not followed. So it is a use of copyright to ensure free access to a particular work. So with that in mind, it's a very simple and straightforward license agreement and intent. The first version of it was no more than a couple paragraphs of text. It's gotten a lot longer over time because when dealing with copyright, everything gets more complicated the more you dig in at it. Let's look at a couple of those nuances. First, I'm going to talk about international differences. I'm not going to go through the full spectrum of things that international copyright might raise, just a couple. An issue of inclusions, and then finally preferences and expectations. So the international difference that I'm going to talk about in particular is one of moral rights. That's where the right of the author to attribution and integrity of the work can come in. And moral rights are a concept that's more common in civil law systems than in common law systems. U.S. and UK are common law systems. France, Germany, other continental European countries, and other countries around the world are civil law systems. And the civil law systems tend to put a line between things of property which you can grant to other people and things of the personality or the body which you can't, and which is much less true in the U.S. So the way I'll illustrate in the U.S. is you have a lot of things, almost anything you have you can sell as property. You can't sell your arm though, it's part of your body. Similarly, in France, Germany, continental European countries, you have unwaivable rights. You cannot contract away around the integrity of your name and of your work. Copyright functions differently in that you can't assign all of copyright there. You can really grant certain licenses. Some personality and publicity license rights in the U.S. that are not in copyright are similar to this. And there's actually a CC BY case that instance I'll mention in a moment. So the 4.0 version of the license is well aware of this, and it deals with this in a section that talks about what the license can't do and can't cover. It says, to the extent possible, a licensor waives or agrees not to assert moral rights. In many cases, that extent may be none in terms of a binding legal agreement or a covenant not to sue or something like that. This is a difference in different laws and different legal systems. I believe in Canada the moral rights can be waived. But I think there's some. But it's a really hard line difference where the people in France will look at you can waive this right. They think of things like work for hire in the U.S. is an unpleasant concept to them. The idea that your creative work might belong to your corporation instead of to you. Inclusions. There was a column by a scientist, photographer, columnist in Scientific American a little more than a year ago, titled "The Awkward Copyright Collision of Fair Use in Creative Commons." So he goes to a considerable amount of effort to take beautiful photographs of various insects that he studies in his research. And when he's approached for permission by other biologists to use his photographs in their scientific papers that they're submitting, his general response in most cases is that you do not need my permission. I believe that use is covered under fair use. Go right ahead. The exception is for submissions to open access journals that require all of the things submitted with an open access paper to bear the same license as the paper. So if the paper is to be published as CC BY, then a photograph that goes with the paper must also be published as CC BY. Why do journals do this? Well, as somebody who designs rights databases for a living, the problem of tracking different copyright permissions at many different levels of a publication is daunting. Let alone the consideration that end users will quite often, if you're lucky enough to have them read the copyright permissions on the journal itself, that's a triumph. And getting them to read the different copyright permissions for every individual object on the page is yet another challenge. And because he relies on his income stream from commercial organizations, commercial publishers for his photographs, he doesn't want to commit his work into the CC BY license as would be required by that activity. So how does that? So, in short, in a non-away journal, he is perfectly willing for his works to be published under fair use, because that publication in a non-away journal doesn't grant any additional rights to the reader to use that photograph other than fair use in particular, which would rarely, if ever, cover commercial republications. In an open access journal, until I'm used to going to the whiteboard. In an open access journal, the CC BY license would grant that commercial permission as long as the attribution were accompanied. So this is about a conflict of motivations. When he is a scientist and thinking like a scientist, he wants to commit his research to the widest possible audience and for it to become part of the commons of knowledge. As a photographer, he wants to support research, but he wants to be compensated for commercial use of his material. So that's the thing. The differences between the researcher and the subject of his research. When he is producing works, that he doesn't want to. As part of his art, as part of his creativity, he doesn't want to commit them to the same commons of knowledge. Now, if we move outside science and think in the humanities, the implications of CC BY become even more manifest. A composer who might be flattered or honored to have a substantial amount of music reproduced in an academic paper under no reuse permit, with no reuse permissions, might not be as flattered or honored to have given away permission to the world to reproduce and perform that work for free. Similarly, the poet, a substantial of whose poem might be reproduced in a paper as well. Even within science, scientific and medical illustrators generally do not function under the same economic model as researchers. They are paid to do a piece of work or to produce a work that is then republished under very specific permissions. And again, without the income stream from their work, they might be harmed. So I think that's another way of reading this powerful sentence from the BOAI Declaration. To be more specific, the literature that should be freely accessible online is that which scholars give to the world without expectation of payment. This isn't. It's not only this broad declaration is also a restriction. It's not necessarily saying that everything in the world should be free. And that takes talk of motivations takes me to preferences. There have been a couple of studies by publishers that show that many researchers prefer the more restrictive licenses to CC by wide margins in these studies, in particular the more restrictive non-commercial uses. So it's possible to say these are studies by publishers and look and question their motivation and hence their methodology. But they show a clear discomfort among the researchers they survey with unrestricted commercial use. And I am not surprised at that, because in the realm of CC BY outside scientific publishing, this has occurred as well. Yahoo has been bitten by this a number of times on the Flickr service. I used to be in a lot of meetings with the product manager of Flickr, and he said, "That's a great business. Wouldn't you love it? Wouldn't you love it if you could own that?" Because as the product manager, he felt he had no control over it. Flickr is one of the first photo sharing sites, and they were very successful encouraging photographers to upload, contribute, and license under very permissive licenses, including CC BY. Gorgeous photography across the spectrum of nature photography, art photography, everything, and a lot of it. And they were very proactive early on in allowing photographers and requiring photographers to specify copyright permissions, ranging from all rights reserved to CC BY. And most recently last year, but several times during their history, Yahoo has tried to make their first dollar from Flickr by selling reproductions of these photographs. The most recently, they were going to sell high-quality canvas framed reprints of photographs. Those that photographers gave them up with license to them. Through other than a Creative Commons license, they would give a cut. Things that were provided them on CC BY were not going to get a cut. Yahoo would simply collect the full price and keep it. And the photographers who had uploaded these works under CC BY were outraged that somebody was making money from the work that they had contributed to the world for free, which I think shows a misunderstanding of what the license that they were using was intended to support. Overall, I've seen other in scholarly publishing, there are complaints within scholarly publishing about the unauthorized or inappropriate anthologizing of articles. Not necessarily because there's reputational harm, but because somebody's making money off it. Like if there's a CC BY license on an article, I can grab 10 of them and upload them to Amazon and start selling ebooks and collections of white papers. Now that is what we are supposed to be allowed to do. with the CC BY license. It's not any commercial use is permitted as long as appropriate attribution is given. Many people are completely okay with this. So, many people have not thought through that implication. So it's about expectations management. So in order to get to talk about managing expectations and think about how we go forward and and try to manage these confusions from the start, I think we can look at a much older open licensing movement, the open source movement for open source software. The first open license for that was created in 1985, and by any measure, the free software movement has been unbelievably successful. At least hundreds of thousands of projects, when you count the number of times people have derived works from hundreds of thousands of projects, it's in the millions or tens of millions. There are literally billions of users of open source software. This has large amounts of open source software. If you've got an Android phone, it's got even more open source software in it. Hundreds of billions of dollars of commercial value have been created through open source software. So there's a key difference in software from mere text, which is that the GPL license. Software comes in two parts. There's the source code, which you compile to make the program that you can actually use. What the GPL, the GNU public license, states is that GPL licensed software, you must be able to you must distribute the source along with the running copy. Anybody can change that source and produce new running copies and distribute them freely as long as they distribute the source as well under the same license. So the software can change and be modified and adapted as long as the source and the new source and is made available under the same license. It just zigs and zags from project to project without any objection, and the only problem is if the license is removed or changed, or if the source is not made available. This has been legally tested in general through the television set-top box industry. Your cable box has a lot of the same software that's in this in it, and or some of the same software that Android runs on top of. And those manufacturers have tended not to be as forthcoming as they are supposed to be about their provision of the source for their GNU licensed software. And in several cases, those manufacturers have been forced to settle and amend their ways. I believe there's an outright loss in court in Germany on a GPL licensed software case. So the way that it works, this is the model that gave birth to the CC BY, is that he says that you may not believe that this license has this sort of power to require you to carry it along with it. The license itself reads like an argument because at the time that it was written, it was an argument. However, all rights are reserved other than those granted through this agreement. So if you don't believe that this agreement works this way, you have no rights to use the software at all. By propagating the work, you signify that you have accepted the license. So the motivations for open source are very familiar to us from open access, but not in spirit. They want to make sure there is free software. They want to make sure that software can be made available even if there is not a substantial commercial market for it. So bringing a software product to market for sale is a very expensive proposition that not every software project is suitable for. Things that are only parts of other programs. But open source software has led to the publication of software that wouldn't have a market otherwise. Individual learning and reputation. Many organizations interview programmers based on their contributions to open source packages that they can see. So some of the successes have been legal force, adoption, an explosion of innovation. Whole categories of software exist only in open source, new kinds of databases and so on. before open source, there was really no commons of software knowledge. You would study computer science in college, you get a job working in a software company, and learn how people really do it. And there was this huge gulf between the academic community and the commercial community. And that is really in the process of being erased, and everybody is working from the same body of knowledge. So it's the challenges there is a profusion of licenses, many without those copy left, travel with the software, contagious provisions. Again, the iPhone uses software that has a very permissive license. Android uses a lot of less permissive licenses like the GPL. There's a huge free rider problem. Many companies use open source software without contributing to it. Companies that try to subsist solely on pure open source and free source have not been very successful. The very successful companies that exist in general exist by by layering something else on top of the free software. There's an open source version that's free. There's an enterprise version that you have to pay for. Android, you can download all of the source to, but that's not what actually is installed on your phone. Most open source projects that are successful are funded by non-open source work, your day job, or your company's day job. Unforeseen consequences, and this is a big one. The enormous, I would say, unanticipated by anybody's wildest dreams of open source has meant that there is absolutely critical software running everywhere that is maintained by very small unfunded teams. The Hartley software defect, I think there was a 60-minute story about it because it affected so much of what we were doing. That's in a piece of software called OpenSSL that is maintained by 3 developers, only one of them full-time, on a total of $40,000 in funding a year before this catastrophic defect was emerged and companies began to contribute huge grants to it. Shell shock, I think there was, again, this reached mass media, is in pieces of software that are used by almost every computer and almost every web server, literally hundreds of millions of web servers in the world. And these were problems that subsisted in public view where anybody could have found them, in the case of the Bash project, for 30 years. But nobody found them until people started exploiting. These are things that the wide public availability of the source code was supposed to prevent. So the tragedy of the commons is a real phenomenon in open source in terms of people using and not committing. But there's also a lot of trusting. Everybody is using it, so it must be good. Everybody, in the same sense, you might see everybody being able to read a paper and assume that it's gone through peer review and assume that the community of science has looked at it, but nobody's actually reviewed it or verified it. Another case, the most popular suite of cryptographic software in the world, which is called GTG, is maintained by one developer for the last many years, who is literally living below the poverty line off donations to the site from voluntary donations. Less than $25,000 a year, a programmer able to work on the most sophisticated software in the world. So the world is full of free riders, and corporations, Google, Facebook, are all using this software, and none of them lifted a finger to help him until he said he was going to have to stop because he was hungry. So, open access motivations, free access to research, path to publication for all worthy research, ensure public access. These are all very reminiscent. We're in some senses we're traveling over a path that has been trodden before. We've had successes. We're having rapid growth, adoption by critical organizations in the ecosystem, new journals. We're seeing license profusion and confusion, a lot of controversy over hybrid journals. Is CC BY the right license? Do we need something more stringent? Do we need something even less stringent? We have a fraudulent or predatory publication problem, and we have overall an entire industry in transition, reacting to this movement. But we don't know how it turns out. We don't know what the unforeseen consequences are yet because we haven't had time for them to occur. So that's good and bad because we have an opportunity to try to encourage good outcomes and inhibit bad. As long as we start thinking about the world as it will be if the open access model prevails to the extent that open source software has. That's what I want to leave you with, and thank you for your